Good morning, welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, we are discussing Indian architecture, and so far we have discussed the evolution of Indian architecture up to Gupta period. Today we will try to understand the architecture during the Gupta age and even up to the advent of Delhi Sultanate. For discussion on this very topic, we have in studio Dr. Shankar Kumar. He teaches history in Hindu College in Delhi University, and he has a specialization in ancient India. Certainly his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic. So on behalf, I welcome him for the EduSet lecture on this topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrenji. Good morning, viewers. The last couple of discussions that we had related to Indian architecture, we began from the Neolithic times, the times when mankind started making permanent dwelling units for themselves, moved across Harappan civilization, the 6th century BC epoch, or the defining movement of ancient Indian history, in the sense that it was second urbanization that happened around that time. We talked about the Mauryan architecture and the changes brought by the Mauryan times. Post-Mauryan scenario is something that we discussed yesterday, and tried to look at major social and political changes, of course, with relation to the economy, changing economy of the times. And we tried to see the changing architectural styles in relation to these changes. And this is extremely important. We finished yesterday's discussion with reference to what happened in the post-Mauryan times with respect to the coming of the Shungas and so forth. And the religious changes, in the sense Buddhism and Jainism also underwent major schisms around this time. The different sects of Buddhism and Jainism, like Hinayan and Mahayana in Buddhism, Shwetambar and Digambar in Jainism, all these changes impacted the religious beliefs and religious systems, also the way people went about worshipping gods and remembering Buddha or Jain. And alongside that, the Vaishnav and Shaiv traditions in Brahmanical religion also, the sheer fact that Mahayana Buddhism allowed votive donations by private individuals also, and deity worship, sculptures, Gandhar and Mathura traditions had flourished by around this time. So all these changes impacted the temple architecture in its inception phase. And it is the rock cut caves and the architecture associated with it and so forth, which had started making its appearance around this time. And by the time we come to the Gupta period, which is around 4th century AD onwards, up to 6th century, we find that the actual, you can say, prototypes of the later day Hindu temples with which we are so familiar, the foundations of such structures, such architectural specimen were laid around this time. And it is in this context that the Golden Age epithet for the Gupta period is extremely relevant for our discussion. This Golden Age epithet of the Gupta period primarily sustains on account of the cultural attainments around this time. All of us know that Gupta period is associated with some major efflorescence in, say, literature, in the realm of art, and also architecture, that is the subject matter of our discussion, and so forth. Even in the realm of mathematics and sciences, there were major attainments in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and so forth. So these are they constitute the cultural attainments of the Mauryan period, And although the economic and social aspect of the Gupta period is critiqued by several historians to counter the notion of the golden age, nevertheless, the efflorescence in the cultural domain is distinctly noteworthy for the Gupta period. We say this because this is the period when we have the marvelous specimen of art and architecture in the Ajanta and Ellora caves, which can be ascribed to this period. The sculptures are chiseled in a very proportional way, and the eye for the details is very much there. The carvings are intricate, and they are being done on permanent material like stone and not on timber, as was the case earlier around the Mauryan period. Even the columns of the buildings or even the cave architecture through its carvings tries to come as close to the carvings on timber in the earlier times. So, in one sense, we can say that some bit of inspiration is still being drawn from the architecture on timber, which timber being a soft material. Of course, it is easy to carve and chisel it. But on stone, one has to be very precise, and it requires fair degree of craftsmanship to replicate the same kind of carvings on stones. When we move beyond the Gupta period, we find that such carvings are being done on very hard monoliths during the Pallav period and so forth. The temples, the shore temples that we get to see around this time, the post-Gupta period, are made on granite stones, and that is very difficult to chisel. So that's how, but since probably those stones were locally available, so they use that. But otherwise, a craftsman or a mason engaged in such activities would choose an appropriate material, of course, from the locally available resources. So a soft stone, maybe red sandstone as was used by the Ashok, and of course there are other variants of soft stones which were used to do the embellishment on these structures. Now, Gupta period marks, as you can see on this slide, the culmination of earlier styles and the beginning of new trends and techniques in architecture. When I say culmination of earlier styles, please keep in mind the discussion that we had yesterday over Indian architecture, that to begin with, it was not free standing structure that came up. Rather, an existing mountain was dug and some embellishments were carried out within that. So it was a kind of cave architecture, so to say, in which Buddhist monasteries and viharas existed. Now, during the Gupta period, we find some bit of improvisation on that. As you can see on the slide, there are some columns beyond the mountain, which is protruding outside the mountain, and these are structural additions. These are freestanding structures which have been created by human ingenuity, by human labor, and that is not part of the naturally existing mountain in which it has been dug into. Now, this marks the beginning of freestanding architecture, so to say. Now, this is referred to as structural temples, where the load is distributed on created structures and not on pre-existing natural forms like a mountain or a mound or something of that sort. It is this aspect which in the subsequent times experiences all the more improvisation, and we have freestanding temples and structures coming out of these cave structures and standing all alone, which housed several idols ranging from Vaishnavites and Vishnuism tradition, and also Shaiva traditions, and several other gods drawn from the pantheon of the Puranas. Let's remember that Gupta period coincides with the period in which the Puranas started being written. And in the Brahmanical tradition of Puran writing, as we all are aware of, there is a pantheon of gods. So quite a few new gods appear as important gods like Durga, Ganesh, apart from some pre-existing eminent gods in the Brahmanical pantheon of gods like Shiv, Vishnu, Vasudeva, and several other variants and incarnations. This is also the time when incarnations in Vishnu and Shaiva traditions started being talked about, and their virtues being extolled and so forth in the Puranas. And we have these figures as the central deity in these temples. So the temple architecture owes its beginning, the modern temple architecture with which we are so familiar, owes its beginning in structural terms to the Gupta period. And the Ajanta, Ellora, of course, are a very rich specimen of art and craft kind of example of the period. But alongside, we have the temple, cave temple at Udaigiri, of which you see the picture. And in this, this is not to be confused with the Udaigiri of Udaigiri caves of Odisha and so forth, but this is near Bhopal, this is near Vidisha. And there we find the extra protruding portico-like structure, which are structural in nature, which are freestanding structures coming up and housing Vishnu, the deity. And that's how these things begin. And we have subsequent improvisation in such temple architecture. Now, as you can see on your slide, this is a photograph of a freestanding temple. Now, this belongs to the Gupta period. There is no pronounced shikhar over this. And this tells us that shikhar or the top structure, conical structure, or depending on the part of India that we are talking of, it kept varying. And to begin with, we have varieties of temples with flat roofs also, as was the pre-existing tradition. So it has immediately come out of the cave architecture, and that's why we have this kind of a temple in central India. Subsequently, we find improvisations over it, aesthetics, and the religious beliefs and doctrines and the sensibilities get incorporated in the architecture. So the Hindu conceptualization of heaven and space above leads into having some kind of very high space for temples right above the central deity, which is the Garbhagriha. And that's why we find very lofty kind of shikhars informing the architecture of Hindu temples in the later Gupta and subsequent periods, the temples of South India in the post-Gupta period are magnificent, and their shikhars are just brilliantly made. We shall be talking about the regional variations and the major styles of temples that emerged around this period in regional terms, that is Nagar style, the Dravida style, and the Vesara style subsequently. But to begin with, let's understand that this is how the temple architecture actually emerged as a freestanding specimen of stone architecture. They were of course also made of bricks and other permanent materials. The copper and black stone statues of several Puranic deities abound in the Gupta and post-Gupta period. Particularly in the post-Gupta period, in the Pal and Sena dynasties, we have an abundance of black stone statues and also bronze statues, which are actually replicas of the central deities emerging during the Gupta period, and they were housed, of course, in separate temples. The site plan, the actual structure of the temple followed some pattern, and it majorly was square format, square shape in which it came up. But there are variations. Some could be rectangular, some could be circular, and with some corners protruding. But majorly it was a square pattern which constituted the central portion of the temple. And of course, as per the beliefs and rituals and conceptualization of worshipping God in Brahmanical tradition, there were rectangular or circular passages around the central garbhagriha, around which people could move around, and on the walls we have frescoes, that is sculpturing on the walls, or mural paintings, as is so exquisitely present in Ajanta and Ellora, with which we are so familiar. And the shikhars keep varying. As you can see on the slide, it's a flat roof. Some early temples have not so pronounced conical roofs, which is working as a shikhar, and subsequently we have very huge shikhars at the top of the garbhagriha. So the courtyard around the temple parisar and the parikrama space around the central deity and the management, the space management of the sanctum sanctorium over which the shikhar had to be made. So all these constitute the plan requirements of the Hindu temples emerging around this time in the Gupta period. And even to this day, even to the present times, by and large, it is the same pattern which we see in the temple architecture, and that is why such trends having begun during this period assumes extra significance. Now, since we had been talking of the regional variations or the varieties in which the subcontinental history of our culture presents itself in diverse architectural specimen, basically or majorly, three kinds of styles or three styles of temple architecture can be discerned in the which began during the Gupta period, and in the subsequent period, the post-Gupta period, it elaborated itself. They are the Nagar style, the Dravida style, and the Vesara style. Nagar style stands for most of the Brahmanical temples, the pattern betrayed by most of the Brahmanical temples in North India. And there the shikhar is almost beehive shaped, and it could be rectangular with spectacular visual effects, and that's the improvisations that were made subsequently. So the basic structure is rectangular, or you can say square pattern, and over that we have the shikhars, which are beehive shaped, and such beehive structures as part of the shikhar were made in such a way that it looked like different rectangular pieces placed over each other to give a very pleasing and aesthetically gratifying visual effect. So that is how subsequent embellishments were made, and then intricate carvings on the columns and the panels and the parikrama space in the form of frescoes and so forth is something which is so characteristic of a Hindu temple today, and that is how it all came into being. Of course, all the three variants that we are talking of, Nagar, Dravid and Vesar styles, we shall be talking about the Dravid and Vesar style subsequently. Of all these three, the actual way in which this was made in terms of carrying the load of this structure, it was beam and trabeate kind of building structure, where you have columns, and those columns, vertically erect columns, are combined with each other through beams which are horizontal in nature, and they all are connected, over which brick or stone structure was erected. So the actual load is carried by the beam and the trabeate. This is so distinct from the Islamic architecture, where we have arches and domes, etc., and they don't follow the beam and trabeate structure. So that is a remarkable thing which went on to be labeled as Hindu architecture, because beam and trabeate is something which most of the temples or architectures before the coming of the Sultanate period is seen all across India. The second variant of the temples that we get to see during this period is that of Dravid style, and Dravid style is, as the name itself suggests, it belongs to the South Indian style of temple making. Here, the basic difference, of course, in subsequent period, as a result of several elaborations, there were several other differences, but basic difference is that here the tower or the shikhar is not beehive shaped as was the case in North India, but it was pyramid shaped. And this pyramid shape structure at the top of the Garbhagriha in the form of a shikhar was also improvised upon in several South Indian temples, and there were the bottom part of the shikhar had a larger rectangular or square shaped structure, over which smaller panel structure was kept and fixed, and that's how. So there is a gradual decrease in terms of stories. So it appears that the shikhar itself had several stories, several layers, and that gave a distinct look or visual effect to the Dravid style temples of South India. They are also characterized quite distinctly with reference to their northern counterpart of Nagar style, in the sense that the Dravid style temples had magnificent gateways which were referred to as the gopurams, and this became a characteristic feature of the South Indian temples. Very big, magnificent gates, intricately carved, the panels having a lot of embellishments and frescoes, and it carried quite a few figures and sculptures depicting several stories from the Indian mythology, and it was a kind of narrative also. So the entire story of say Ramayana or Buddha's life gets depicted in on these panels, either which is part of the parikrama or the temple compound. So if you move around the garbhagriha of a temple, and if you keep looking at the circumventing sculptures or pictures, basically you start from the beginning of a story, and by the time you finish the parikrama, you are through with the entire story. It could be Ramayana story, it could be Buddha's life story, and so forth, or some major incidents or events associated with the religious belief system and the mythological aspect of our heroes and so forth. That is how these decorations and embellishments were added to the temple architecture. And all these things required fair degree of craftsmanship, the sense of symmetry, the sense of balance, and so forth. So in a sense, it presumes that fair degree of arithmetic or geometric understanding was already known to people, and the religious sensibilities had to be incorporated in these architectural specimen. Remember, in our earlier discussion, we had talked about the nature of such buildings, and most of these buildings being sponsored by the king himself, of course, served another purpose, and that was the ideological justification for the rule of a particular king. It gave them some kind of a religious legitimacy to rule, and it was almost a fashion and source of legitimacy for the kings to construct new temples with their central deities in mind. For example, the Guptas were known to be followers of Vishnu, and there is a prominence of Vishnu as a deity in the Gupta temples, and also their incarnations. These are some of the aspects of Indian culture which get incorporated in the architecture of the period. The politics of the time, for instance, some historians also have analyzed the hierarchy of deities which are presented in Hindu temples as a kind of replica of the social political scenario of feudalism, where there is one feudal lord and there are several smaller deities who are in some way or the other owing allegiance to the central deity, but their stature is not equal to the central deity. And so in a sense, if we are to talk of the culture of India and its replication in architectural specimen, this is one of the best examples that we can cite. because that sense of hierarchy is maintained in terms of deities and also the size of temples in a bigger temple complex, where central deity's temple is of maximum height and most elaborate, while there are several other deities, also smaller deities present, but their level of elaboration and height of the structure is not so huge. So there is an implicit sense of hierarchy. At the same time, there is a sense of connect also, which is noticeable. So these are some of the aspects of Nagar and Dravid style. Of course, there is third variant of the temple architecture in India, and that is the Vesar style, which is in fact some kind of a stylistic overlap of the two that we talked about, Nagar and Dravid. And this kind of Vesar style temples, their specimen could be seen from the area around, say, in the middle of South and North India, around Karnataka and Andhra. The Hoysalas are renowned to be makers of temples belonging to Vesar style and so forth. So it is like intermixture of the two major styles. But let's also keep in mind that there were several regional variations apart from the predominant three styles of temple architecture that we have spoken of. So that takes care of the kind of temples that we get to see in the Gupta and post-Gupta period, and also the materials that were used by, particularly in the post-Gupta period, the hard granite rocks, the monoliths carved out of it by the Pallavas and so forth. The Cholas are referred to be the magnificent temple makers. Some of them are just beautifully preserved to the present times. And that's the story of the temples till around the post-Gupta period. Another epoch, we can say, in the history of Indian architecture is the coming of the Islamic or Turkish rulers from Turkey and subsequently Central Asia, who were informed about or who were socialized with another kind of architectural techniques, which we already alluded to, in the form of dome, in the form of arches. And when they came to India and established themselves as political rulers here, we are here referring to the Sultanate period around the beginning of the 13th century. So once they established themselves and they were here to stay and rule, of course, in order to articulate their political aspirations and seek legitimacy of their rule, they started creating their own structures, and they wanted to begin with replicate those styles and techniques with which they themselves were familiar. For instance, as you can see on your slide, this is part of the Qutub complex, and the mosque which is part of that complex. Now, the arch that you get to see here in the picture is not a true arch. And all of us know that in the quest for political dominance and to assert their political supremacy over the pre-existing rulers, these Sultanate rulers resorted to the practice of destroying the pre-existing temples or the places of worship, and because it also had political connotation, and they in the absence of the appropriate building material, they used the same ruins of the destructed temples to erect Islamic looking architectural specimen during the period. This particular example is that of temple panels which have been used as building materials, and this is something that you can see even today. So, although it is Islamic looking architecture, but the actual material is drawn from the ruins of the pre-existing temples. Of course, the religious sensibilities of Islam did not allow them to represent human figurines and so forth, so they obliterated it to the extent possible, but other motifs like lotus and inverted bells and columns, they are very much visible in these early specimen of Islamic architecture during the Sultanate period. The arch that you just saw on the photograph is not a true arch in the sense that a true arch has a different technique of making. The load is basically borne by the cornerstone, which is at the center of the arc, and there are supporting, you can say, stones designated by different names just to make a true arch. But these specimen in the early part of the Sultanate period around Iltutmish's times or Balban's time try to give the pretense of being an arc, but actually they are not made as true arcs. Probably because they did not have the trained masons in India locally available who were aware of this technique. And of course, in the ancient times there are several claims by several historians that dome was something which was known to the Indians, but perhaps it had fallen into disuse, and there were no expert masons available who could make true arches and domes. It took Sultanate period time, say more than 50, 60, 70 years. It is only around the time of Alauddin Khilji. During the rule of Khiljis, for the first time we start seeing true arches getting made in India. And of course, since a lot of time had elapsed, therefore the rule had stabilized, the contacts with the Central Asia and beyond had also concretized, and thereafter of course it had become easy to make true arches and domes in India also using local material, and therefore we find such a specimen of Islamic architecture coming up after a considerable period of initial beginning or incipient stage. Alongside this, by the time we reach the Mughal period and or even Lodhis, etc., we find that the religious aspirations or sensibilities of Islam had different requirements as compared to the Brahmanical sensibilities or Hindu sensibilities, and similarly the architecture, the Islamic architecture also had to accommodate those sensibilities. For instance, in a mosque, now Islam being a congregational kind of religion and worshipping mode is congregational, therefore they required more open space in contrast to a Hindu temple where the garbh-grih is a very small area. And the enclosure is very small. This did not suit the Islamic religious sensibilities, which required bigger area in their mosques, open area for congregational purpose. Then the direction of the mosque had to be directed westwards so far as India is concerned, because Mecca happens to be the west of India. So these are some other religious requirements which informed Islamic mosques and architecture in the Sultanate and Mughal period also, and this is quite true of the earlier Brahmanical and Hindu temples also, because there the Brahmanical sensibilities, Vedic sensibilities or Puranic sensibilities had to be taken into account. So and then another very important thing that we should be noting here is the requirements of minarets, and we are very familiar with it because we know of Taj Mahal and so forth. These minarets actually perform the functional duty of the person responsible to call people for congregation in Islam, for namaz and so forth, and that's why it was a minaret kind of a structure. But subsequently it got fossilized, and it merely remained a structural requirement in a mosque, devoid of that functionality. So there is a stylized aspect of architecture, Islamic architecture, apparent in these trends. Similarly, since Islamic religion forbade any kind of human depiction as sculpture or photograph or paintings and so forth, therefore the decorations that they resorted to on the walls, on the panels, on the structures was essentially something written in Arabic, and it were the letters which were beautified with foliage and plant stems and leaf-like structure, so as to give a very pleasing look to the viewer. This is something that you can see even in Qutub Minar, where Arabic words are very intricately and nicely written, and to an uninformed viewer, to a lay viewer, it gives the impression of some kind of a diagram or some kind of an artistic piece, but actually these are Arabic words written. They are arabesque, they are referred to as arabesque. Similarly, very intricate jali works, and the concept of light filtering through it, because noor or light is so central to Islam, and some magnificence associated with light, and the beauty of the marbles or red sandstone, giving very small, intricate, nicely carved holes and the light coming through it. So this technique was also very profusely used in these medieval architectures, and for beautifying the forts or mosques and so forth. This is something that we can see in Taj Mahal also. And at times they put some gems and precious stones in between to add beauty to these structures. So these are some of the trends that emerged in the Sultanate and Mughal period, and by the time we come to the Mughal period, we start seeing some kind of an amalgamation of the Hindu architecture and Islamic architecture. When we say Hindu architecture, the basic premise is the beam trabeate structure, and when we say Islamic architecture, basically we are thinking of arches and domes. In Delhi, you can see the Firoz Shah Kotla, which houses several stories, and in that the earliest amalgamation can be seen. One story is using arc to join two pillars, so it is arched pillars that we get to see. The subsequent story or the subsequent floor is following beam and trabeate structure. And during the Mughal period, it acquired political connotation as well, because Akbar resorted to the policy of taking a large section of Hindu population also together into the administration through Mansabdari and so forth, and that political spirit is getting reflected in the architectural specimen of the period also. So that is to be seen in the structures at Fatehpur Sikri, as you can see on your slide. These stories are beam and trabeate style, although it is in the fort made by Akbar at Fatehpur Sikri, but as you can see that the floors, the rising floors are not following arcs or dome kind of a structure. It is only the top floor which has arches and dome. Otherwise, it is beam and trabeate structure which is used, and this is a very good specimen of the coming together of Hindu and Islamic architectural principles in making magnificent buildings. And there is the sense of the culture or the syncretic culture which is informing the architecture of the period. So these are quite a few fascinating themes about the Mughal architecture and the Hindu temples and so forth. And within that Islamic architectural principles, we also find gradual evolution. For instance, if you compare the Humayun's tomb with Taj Mahal, which of course came subsequently. Of course, Humayun's tomb is also a World Heritage Site, and it is magnificent to look at. The dome over the Humayun's tomb is huge and magnificent. But if you really compare it from technique point of view or even the visual effect, you will find that Taj Mahal's dome is actually more difficult to make, and that is the perfection of dome making, because it is a bulbous dome, almost like an onion. So it is narrow towards the neck, and then again it bulges out and then tapers towards the top. So that is the perfect form of dome which could be attained only during Shah Jahan's period in white marble. Whereas till around Humayun's time, they were trying to make a dome, huge dome, which was also not so easy to make. Nevertheless, it was not a perfect bulbous dome. Rather, it was a kind of hemispherical, big, huge hemispherical structure, which was imposed over the rectangular structure of Humayun Maqbara. So that is something which we can trace in dynamic sense as to how in Indian architecture at different points of time, different political beliefs, religious beliefs, availability of local resources. For instance, Lal Killa of Shah Jahanabad was designed by during the Shah Jahan's period, extensively used red sandstone, whereas in Agra for making Taj Mahal they are using white marbles to very good effect. So utilization of local resources, and then we also saw that towards the beginning of the Sultanate period, on account of the non-availability of the skilled masons, true arches could not be made. Subsequently, true arches started being made, true domes started being made. So gradually all these techniques, architectural techniques evolved. And there is a fair degree of regional variety also. Golconda area or Hyderabad area or Bengal, Bihar area would throw regional variants of essentially these architectural principles. So this is the you can say the story of the evolution of architectural principles in Indian history. and we saw how different cultural, political, and other factors, religious factors, belief systems got incorporated, got frozen in time through these structures.
Okay, so well friends, in 1 hour we were not able to cover all aspects. We just tried to understand the major characteristic and the dominant feature of those days. So I hope you have understood the major point which one need to understand when we talk about the Indian architecture. So with this word, we conclude the lecture, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture. And on behalf, I thank Dr. Shankar Kumar for giving such a wonderful lecture and very simply explaining all the dominant features of the time in a very in 3 lectures of about 1,000 years of Indian architecture evolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.